Chapter 11 of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11 The Sky's the Limit. All that day the three rocket ships sat out on the field. Nobody went up to them, and nobody came from them. Surprisingly, Wayne had found the courage to ignore them. But rumors were circulating wildly. Bruce Gordon felt his nerves creeping out of his skin and beginning to stand on end to test each breeze for danger. With the credit they'd accumulated in the fund, nearly all their collection was theirs. Gordon went out to do some shopping. He stopped when his money was down to 100 credits, hardly realizing what he was doing. When he went out, the street was going crazy. Izzy had been waiting and filling him in. At exactly sundown, the rocket ships had thrown down ramps, and a stream of jeeps had ridden down them and toward the south entrance to the dome. They had presented some sort of paper and forced the guard to let them through. There were about 200 men, some of them armed. They had driven straight to the huge barn-like employment bureau, had chased out the few people remaining there, and had simply taken over. Now there was a sign in front which simply said, Marsport Legal Police Force Headquarters. Then the jeeps had driven back to the rockets, gone on board, and the ships had taken off. Gordon glanced at his watch, finding it hard to believe it could have been done so quickly. But it was 2 hours after sundown. Now a car with a loudspeaker on top rolled into view, a completely armored car. It stopped, and the speaker began operating. Citizens of Marsport, in order to protect your interests from the proven rapacity of the administration here, Earth has revoked the independent charter of Marsport. The past elections are hereby declared null and void. Your homeworld has appointed Marcus Gannett as mayor, with Philip Crane as chief of police. Other members of the council will be by appointment until legal elections can be held safely. The municipal police force is disbanded, and the legal police force is now being organized. All police and officers who remain loyal to the legal government will be accepted at their present grade or higher. To those who now leave the illegal municipal force and accept their duty with the legal force, there will be no question of past conduct, nor will they suffer financially from the change. Banks will be reopened as rapidly as the legal government can extend its control, and all deposits previously made will be honored in full. That brought a cheer from the crowd as the sound truck moved on. Gordon saw two of the police officers nearby fingering their badges thoughtfully. Then another truck rolled into view, and the mayor's canned voice came over it, panting as if he'd had to rush to make the recording. He began directly. Martians, Earth has declared war on us. She has denied us our rights to rule ourselves, a right guaranteed in our charter. We admit there have been abuses. All young civilizations make mistakes. But we've developed and grown. This is an old pattern, fellow Martians. England tried it on her colonies 300 years ago, and the people rose up and demanded their right to rule themselves. They had trouble with their governments too, and they had panics, but they won their freedom, and it made them great. So great that now one nation, not all Earth, but that single nation, is trying to do to us what she wouldn't permit to herself. Well, we don't have an army, but neither do they. They know the people of this world wouldn't stand for the landing of that's right, foreign troops. So they're trying to steal our police force from us and use it for their war. Fellow Martians, they aren't going to bribe us into that. Mars has had enough. I declare us to be in a state of revolution. And since they have chosen the weapons, I declare our loyal and functioning municipal police force to be our army. Any man who deserts will be considered a traitor, but any man who sticks will be rewarded more than he ever expected. We're going to protect our freedom. Let them open their banks, our banks, again, and when they have established your accounts, go in and collect the money. If they give it to you, Mars is that much richer. If they don't, you'll know they're lying. Let them bribe us if they like. We're going to win this war. Gordon felt the crowd's reaction twist again, and he had to admit that Wayne had played his cards well. But it didn't make the question of where he belonged or what he should do any easier. He waited until the crowd had thinned out a little and began heading toward Corey's, with Izzy moving along silently beside him, carrying half the packages. He remembered the promise of forgiveness for all sins on joining the new legal force, but he'd read enough history to know that it was fine as long as the struggle continued. Afterwards, promises grew dim. He had no use for the present administration, but Earth had no right to take over without a formal investigation and a chance for the people to state their choice. Then he grimaced at himself. He was in no position to move according to right and wrong. The only question that counted was how he had the best chance to ride out the storm and to get back to Earth and a normal life. He was still in a brown study as he took the bundles from Izzy and dropped them on his bed. Izzy went out, and Gordon stood staring at the wall. Trench or the new Commissioner Crane? If Earth should win, and they had most of the power, after all, and Bruce Gordon had fought against security, the mines of Mercury were waiting. He picked up the stuff from his bed and started to sweep it aside before he lay down. Then he remembered at last. He knocked on the panel until it finally opened a crack. Here, he told her, food and some other stuff. There are some refuse bags, too. Yell when you want them removed. She took the bundles woodenly until she came to a plastic can. Then she gasped. Water, 2 gallons? There are heat tablets and a skin tub. The salesgirl had explained how 1 gallon was enough in the plastic bag that served as a tub. He had his doubts. Detergent, the whole works. She hauled the stuff in and started to close the panel. Then she hesitated. I suppose I should thank you, but I don't like to be told I stink so much you can't stand me in the next room. Hell, I've gotten so I can't stand your grandfather, he answered. It wasn't that. The panel slammed shut. He still hadn't solved his problem in the morning. Out of habit, he put on his uniform and went across to Izzy's room. But Izzy was already gone. Gordon fished into the pocket of his uniform for paper and a pencil to leave a note in case Izzy came back. His fingers found the half notebook cover instead. He drew it out, scowling at it, and started to crumple it. Then he stopped, staring at the piece of imitation leather and paper that wouldn't bend. His fingers were still stiff as he began tearing off the thin covering with his knife. The paper backing peeled away easily. Under it lay a thin metal plate that glowed faintly even in the dim light of Izzy's room. Gordon nearly dropped it. He'd seen such an identification plate once before. The printing on it leaped at him. This will identify the bearer, Bruce Irving Gordon, as a prime agent of the Office of Solar Security, empowered to make and execute any and all directives under the powers of this office. The printing in the capitals was obviously done by hand, but with the same catalytic ink as the rest of the badge. Murdoch must have prepared it, hidden it in the notebook, then died before the secret could be revealed. A knock sounded from across the hall. Gordon thrust the damning badge as deep into his pouch as he could cram it, and looked out. It was Mother Corey. "You've got a visitor outside," he announced. "Trench. And I don't like the stench of that kind of cop in my place. Get him away, Cobber. Get him away." Gordon found Trench pacing up and down in front of the house, scowling up at it. But the ex-Marine smiled as he saw Bruce Gordon in uniform. "Good. At least some men are loyal. Had breakfast, Gordon?" Gordon shook his head and realized suddenly that the decision seemed to have been taken out of his hands. They crossed the street and went down half a block. "All right," he said when the coffee began waking him. "What's the angle?" Trench dropped the eyes that had been boring into him. "I'll have to trust you, Gordon. I've never been sure, but either you're loyal now, or I can't depend on anyone being loyal." During the night, it seems, the legal force had been recruiting. Wayne Arliss and the rest of the administration had counted on self-interest holding most of the cops loyal to them. They'd been wrong. Legal forces already controlled about half the city. "So?" Gordon asked. He could have told Trench that the fund was good enough reason for most police deserting. Trench put his coffee down and yelled for more. It was obvious he'd spent the night without sleep. "So we're going to need men with guts. Gordon, you had training under Murdoch. You knew his business, and you aren't a coward, as most of these fat fools are. I've got a proposition straight from Wayne." "I'm listening." "Here." Trench threw across a platinum badge. "Take that. Captain at large, and conscript any of the municipal force you want, up to 100. Pick out any place you want. Train them to handle those damned illegals the way Murdoch handled the Stonewall boys. In return, the sky's the limit. Name your own salary once you've done the job. And no kickbacks either." Gordon picked up the badge slowly and buckled it on, while a grim, satisfied smile spread over Trench's features. The problem seemed to have been solved. Gordon should have been satisfied, but he felt like Judas picking up the 30 pieces of silver. He tried to swallow them with the dregs of his coffee, and they stuck in his throat. "Comes the revolution, and we'll all eat strawberries and scream." A hubbub sounded outside, and Trench grimaced as a police whistle sounded, and a municipal cop ran by. "We're in enemy territory," he said. "The legals got this precinct last night. Captain Hendricks and some of his men wanted to come back with full battle equipment and chase them out. I had a hell of a time getting them to take it easy. I suppose that was some damned fool who tried to go back to his beat." "Then you'd better look again," Gordon told him. He'd gone to the door and was peering out. Up the narrow little street was rolling a group of about 70 municipal police and half a dozen small trucks. The men were wearing guns, and up the street a man in bright green uniform was pounding his fist up and down in emphasis as he called in over the precinct box. "The idiot!" Trench grabbed Gordon and spun out, running toward the advancing men. "We've got to stop this. Get my car up the street. Call Arliss on the phone, under the dash. Or Wayne. I'll bring Hendricks." Trench's system made some sense, and this business of marching as to war made none at all. Gordon grabbed the phone from under the dash. A sleepy voice answered to say that Commissioner Arliss and Mayor Wayne were sleeping. They'd had a hard night, and— "Damn it, there's a rebellion going on," Gordon told the man. "Rebellion. Rebellion." He'd meant to say revolution, but— Trench was arguing frantically with the pompous figure of Captain Hendricks. From the other end of the street, a group of small cars appeared, and men began piling out, all in shiny green. "Who's this?" the phone asked. When Gordon identified himself, there was a snort of disgust. Yes, congratulations. Trench was quite right. You're fully authorized. Did you call me out of bed just to check on that, young man?" "No, Then he hung up. Hendricks had dropped to his knees and fired before Trench could knock the gun from his hands. There was no answering fire. The legals simply came boiling down the street, equipped with long pikes with lead-weighted ends. And Hendricks came charging up, his men straggling behind him. Gordon was squarely in the middle. He considered staying in Trench's car and letting it roll past him, but he'd taken the damned badge. Hell, he said in disgust. He climbed out just as the two groups met. It all had a curious feeling of unreality. Then a man jumped for him, swinging a pike, and the feeling was suddenly gone. His hand snapped down sharply for a rock on the street. The pike whistled over his head, barely missing, and he was up, squashing the big stone into the face of the other. He jerked the pike away, kicked the man in the neck as he fell, and unsheathed his knife with the other hand. Trench was a few feet away. The man might be a louse, but he was also a fighting machine of first order. Still, he'd already captured one of the pikes. Now he grinned tightly at Gordon and began moving toward him. Gordon nodded. In a brawl such as this, two working together had a distinct advantage. Then a yell sounded as more legals poured down the street. One of them was obviously Izzy, wearing the same green as the others. Gordon felt something hit his back and instinctively fell, soaking up the blow. He managed to bend his neck and roll, coming to his feet. His knife slashed upwards, and the legal fell, almost on top of the security badge that had dropped from Gordon's pouch. He jerked himself down and scooped it up, his eyes darting for Trench. He stuffed it back, ducking a blow. Then his glance fell on the entrance to Mother Corey's house, with Sheila Corey coming out of the seal. Gordon threw himself back. He had to get to her. He hadn't been watching as closely as he should. He saw the pike coming down and tried to duck. He was vaguely conscious later of looking up to see Sheila dragging him into some entrance, while Trench ran toward them. Sheila and Trench together, and the security badge was still in his pouch. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Wife or Prisoner. Something cold and damp against his forehead brought Gordon part way out of his unconsciousness finally. There was the softness of a bed under him, and the aftertaste of migranol on his tongue. He tried to move, but nothing happened. The drug killed pain, but only at the expense of a temporary paralysis of all voluntary motion. There was a sudden withdrawal of the cooling touch on his forehead, and then hasty steps that went away from him, and the sound of a door closing. Steps sounded from outside. His door opened, and there was the sound of two men crossing the room, one with the heavy shuffle of Mother Corey. No wonder the boys couldn't find where you'd stashed him, Mother. Must be a bloody big false section you've got in that trick mattress of yours. Big enough for him and for Trench, Izzy, Mother Corey's wheezing voice agreed. Had to be big to fit me. You mean you hid Trench out too? Izzy asked. There was a thick chuckle and the sound of hands being rubbed together. A respectable landlord has to protect himself, Izzy. For hiding and a convoy back, our Captain Trench gave me a paper with immunity from the municipal force. Used that with a bit of my old reputation to get your Mayor Gannett the same from the legals. Gannett didn't want Mother Corey to think the municipals were kinder than the legals. So you're in the only neutral territory in Marsport. Not that you deserve it. Lay off, Mother, Izzy said sharply. I told you I had to do it. I take care of the side that pays my cut, and the bloody administration pulled the bug on my beat twice. Only honest thing to do was join the legals. And getting your rating up to a lieutenant, Mother Corey observed, without telling Cobb or Gordon. Like I say, honesty pays, Mother, when you know how to collect. Hell, I figured Bruce would do the same. He's a right gee. Mother Corey chuckled. Yeah, when he forgets he's a machine. How about a game of shanks? The steps moved away. The door closed again. Bruce Gordon got both eyes open and managed to sit up. The effects of the drug were almost gone, but it took a straining of every nerve to reach his uniform pouch. His fingers, clumsy and uncertain, groped back and forth for the badge that wasn't there. He heard the door open softly, but made no effort to look up. The reaction from his effort had drained him. Fingers touched his head carefully, brushing the hair back delicately from the side of his skull. Then there was a biting sting of antiseptic, sharp enough to bring a groan from his lips. Sheila's hair fell over her face as she bent to replace his bandages. Her eyes wandered toward his, and the scissors and bandages on her lap hit the floor as she jumped to her feet. She turned toward her room, then hesitated as he grinned crookedly at her. "Hi, Cuddles," he said flatly. She bit her lips and turned back, while a slow flush ran over her face. Her voice was uncertain. "Hello, Bruce. You okay?" "How long have I been like this?" 15 hours, I guess. It's almost midnight." She bent over to pick up the bandages and to finish with his head. "Are you hungry? There's some canned soup. I took the money from your pocket. Or coffee?" "Coffee." He forced himself up again. Sheila propped the flimsy pillow behind him, then went into her room and came back. Sheila propped the flimsy pillow behind him, then went into her room to come back with a plastic cup filled with brown liquid that passed for coffee here. It was loaded with caffeine at least. "Why'd you come back?" he asked suddenly. "You were anxious enough to pick the lock and get out." "I didn't pick it. You forgot to lock it." He couldn't remember what he'd done after he found the badge. "Okay, my mistake. But why the change of heart?" "Because I needed a meal ticket," she said harshly. "When I saw that legal cop ready to take you, I had to go running out to save you, because I don't have the iron guts to starve like a Martian." It rocked him back on his mental heels. He'd thought that she had been attacking him on the street, but it made more sense this way at that. "You're a fool," he told her bitterly. "You bought a punched meal ticket. Right now I probably have 6 death warrants out on me, and about as much chance of making a living as—" "I'll stick to my chances. I don't have any others now," she grimaced. "You get things done. Now that you've got a wife to support, you'll support her. Just remember, it was your idea." He'd had a lot of ideas, it seemed. "I've got a wife who's holding on to a notebook that belongs to me." "Then where is it?" She shook her head. "I'm keeping the notebook for insurance. Blackmail, Bruce. You should understand that. And you won't find it, so don't bother looking." She went into the other room and shut the door. There was the sound of the lock being worked, and then silence. He stared at the door foolishly, swearing at all women. Then grimaced and turned back to the chair where his uniform still lay. He could stay here fighting with her, or he could face his troubles on the outside. The whole thing hinged on Trench, unless Trench had shown the badge to others. His problem boiled down to a single man. Gordon found 1 tablet of painkiller left in the bottle and swallowed it with the dregs of the coffee. He made sure his knife was in its sheath, and that the gun at his side was loaded. He found his police club, checked the loop at its end, and slipped it onto his wrist. At the door to the hall he hesitated, staring at Sheila's room. Wife or prisoner? He turned it over in his mind. Knowing that her words couldn't change the facts. But in the end, he dropped the key and half his money beside the door, along with a spare knife and one of his guns. He went by Izzy's room without stopping. Technically, the boy was an enemy to all municipals. This might be neutral territory, but there was no use pressing it. Gordon went down the stairs and out through the seal onto the street entrance, still in the shadows. His eyes covered the street in 2 quick scans. Far up, a legal cop was passing beyond the range of the single dim light. At the other end, a pair of figures skulked along, trying the door of each house as they passed. With the cops busy fighting each other, this was better pickings than outside the dome. He saw the legal cop move out of sight and stepped onto the street, trying to look like another petty crook on the prowl. He headed for the nearest alley, which led through the truck yard of Nick the Croup. The entrance was in nearly complete darkness. Gordon loosened his knife and tightened his grip on the locust stick. Suddenly a whisper of sound caught his ears. He stopped, not too quickly, and listened, but everything was still. 100 feet farther on, and within 20 yards of the trucks, a swishing rustle reached his ears, and light slashed hotly into his eyes. Hands grabbed at his arm, and a club swung down toward his knife. But the warning had been enough. Gordon's arms jerked upwards to avoid the reaching hands. His boot lifted, and the flashlight spun aside, broken and dark with a continuous motion. He switched the knife to his left hand in a thumb-up position and brought it back. There was a grunt of pain. He stepped backwards and twisted. His hands caught the man behind, lifted across a hip, and heaved, just before the front man reached him. The 2 ambushers were down in a tangled mess. There was just enough light to make out faint outlines, and Gordon brought his locust club down twice, with the hollow thud of wood on skulls. His head was swimming in hot maelstrom of pain, but it was quieting as his breathing returned to normal. As long as his opponents were slower or less ruthless, he could take care of himself. The trouble, though, was that Isaiah Trench was neither slow nor squeamish. Gordon gathered the 2 hoodlums under his arms and dragged them with him. He came out in the truck yard and began searching. Nick the Croup had ridden his reputation long enough to be careless, and the 3rd truck had its key still in the lock. He threw the 2 men into the back and struck a cautious light. One of them was Jurgens, ape-like follower, his stupid face relaxed and vacant. The other was probably also one of Jurgens' growing mob of protection racketeers. Gordon yanked out the man's wallet, but there was no identification. It held only a small sheaf of bills. He stripped out the money and finally put half of it back into the wallet and dropped it beside the hoodlum. Even in jail, a man had to have smokes. He stuck to the alleys, not using the headlights. After he had locked the 2 in and started the electric motor, he had no clear idea of how the battles were going, but it looked as if the 7th Precinct was still in municipal hands. There was no one at the side entrance to 7th Precinct headquarters, and only 2 corporals on duty inside. The rest were probably out fighting the legals, or worrying about it. One of the corporals started to stand up and halt him, but wavered at the sight of the captain's star that was still pinned to his uniform. "Special prisoners," Gordon told him sharply. "I've got to get information to Trench, and in private." The corporal stuttered. Gordon knocked him out of the way with his elbow, reached for the door to Trench's private office, and yanked it open. He stepped through, drawing it shut behind him, while his eyes checked the position of his gun at his hip. There was no sign of Trench. In his place and in the uniform of a municipal captain sat the heavy figure of Jurgens. Outside, he snapped. Then his eyes narrowed, and a stiff smile came onto his lips as he laid the pen down. "Oh, it's you, Gordon. Where's Captain Trench?" The heavy features didn't change as Jurgens chuckled. "Commissioner Trench, Gordon, it seems Arliss decided to get rid of Mayor Wayne, but didn't count on Wayne's spies being better than his. So Trench got promoted, and I got his job for loyal service and helping the force recruit. My boys always wanted to be cops, you know. Gordon tried to grin in return as he moved closer, slipping the heavy locust club off his wrist. I sent Ape and Mullins out to get in touch with you, Jurgens said, but I guess they didn't reach you before you left. Gordon shook his head slightly, while the nerves bunched and tingled in his neck. They hadn't arrived when I left the house, he said, truthfully enough. Jurgens reached out for tobacco and filled a pipe. He fumbled in his pockets as if looking for a light. Too bad. I knew you weren't in top shape, so I figured a convoy might be handy. Well, no matter. Trench left some instructions about you, and... His voice was perfectly normal, but Gordon saw the hand move suddenly toward the drawer that was half open, and the cigarette lighter was attached to the other side of the desk. The locust stick left Gordon's hand with a snap. It cut through the air a scant 8 feet, jerked to a stop against Jurgens' forehead, and clattered onto the top of the desk, while Jurgens folded over, his mouth still open, his hand slumping out of the drawer. The club rolled toward Gordon, who caught it before it could reach the floor. But Jurgens was only momentarily out. As Gordon slipped the loop over his wrist again, one of the new captain's hands groped, seeking a button on the edge of the desk. The 2 corporals were at the door when Gordon threw it open, but they drew back at the sight of his drawn gun. Feet were pounding below as he found the entrance that led to the truck. He hit the seat and rammed down the throttle with his foot before he could get his hands on the wheel. It was a full minute before sirens sounded behind him, and Nick the Croup had fast trucks. He spotted the squad car far behind, ducked through a maze of alleys, and lost it for a few precious minutes. Then a barricade lay ahead. The trucks faltered as it hit the nearly finished obstacle, and Gordon felt his stomach squashing down onto the wheel. He kept his foot to the floor, strewing bits of the barricade behind him until he was beyond the range of the legal guns that were firing suddenly. Then he stopped and got out carefully, with his hands up. Captain Bruce Gordon, with 2 prisoners, bodyguards of Captain Jurgens. He reported to the 3 men in bright new legal uniforms, who were approaching warily. "How do I sign up with you?" End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Arrest Mayor Wayne. The legal forces were short-handed and eager for recruits. They had struck quickly, according to plans made by experts on Earth, and now controlled about half of Marsport. But it was a sprawling crescent around the central section, harder to handle than the municipal territory. Bruce Gordon was sworn in at once. Then he cooled his heels while the florid, paunchy ex-politician Commissioner Crane worried about his rating and repeated how corrupt Mars was and how the collection system was over, absolutely over. In the end, he was given a captain's pay and the rank of sergeant. As a favor, he was allowed to share a beat with Honest Izzy under Captain Hendricks, who had simply switched sides after losing the morning's battle. Gordon's credits were changed to legal script, and he was issued a trim-fitting green uniform. Then a surprisingly competent doctor examined his wound, rebandaged it, and sent him home for the day. The change was finished, and he felt like a grown man playing with dolls. He walked back, watching the dull-looking people closing off their homes, as they had done at elections. Here and there houses had been broken into during the night. There were occasional buzzes of angry conversation that cut off as he approached. Marsport had learned to hate all cops, and a change of uniform hadn't altered that. Instead, the people seemed to resent the loss of the familiar symbol of hatred. He found Izzy and Randolph at the restaurant across from Mother Corey's. Izzy grinned suddenly at the sight of the uniform. "I knew it, Governor. Knew it the minute I heard Jurgens was a cop. Did you make 'em give you my beat?" He seemed genuinely pleased as Gordon nodded, and then dropped it to point to Randolph. "Guess what, Governor? The Legals bought Randy's Crusader. Traded him an old job press and a bag of scratch for his reputation." "You'll be late, Izzy," Randolph said quietly. Gordon suddenly realized that Randolph, like everyone else, seemed to be Izzy's friend. He watched the little man leave and reached out for the menu. Randolph picked it out of his hand. "You've got a wife home, muckraker. You don't have to eat this filth." Gordon got up, grimaced at the obvious dismissal. But the publisher motioned him back again. "Yeah, the Legals want the Crusader for their propaganda," he said wearily. "New slogans and new uniforms, and none of them mean anything. Here," he drew a small golden band from his little finger. "My mother's wedding ring. Give it to her. And if you tell her it came from me, I'll rip out your guts." He got up suddenly and hobbled out, his pinched face working. Gordon turned the ring over, puzzled. Finally he got up and headed for his room, a little surprised to find the door unlocked. Sheila opened her eyes at his uniform, but made no comment. "Food ready in 10 minutes, she told him. She'd already been shopping and had installed the tiny cooking equipment used in half Marsport. There was also a small iron laying beside a pile of his laundered clothes. He dropped onto the bed wearily, then jerked upright as she came over to remove his boots. But there was no mockery on her face, and oddly, it felt good to him. Maybe her idea of married life was different from his. She was sanding the dishes and putting them away when he finally remembered the ring. He studied it again, then got up and dropped it beside her. He was surprised as she fumbled it on to see that it fitted, and more surprised at the sudden realization that she was entitled to it. She studied it under the glare of the single bulb, and then turned to her room. She was back a few seconds later with a small purse. "I got a duplicate key. Yours is in there," she said thickly. "And something else. I guess I was going to give it to you anyway. I was afraid someone else might find it." He cut her off brusquely, his eyes riveted on the security badge he'd been sure Trench had taken. "Yeah, I know. Your meal ticket was in danger. Okay, you've done your nightly duty. Now get the hell out of my room, will you?" The week went on mechanically while he gradually adjusted to the new angles of being illegal. The banks were open, and deposits honored, as promised. But it was in the printing press script of legal currency, useful only through Mayor Gannett's trick exchanges. Water went up from 14 credits to 80 credits for a gallon of pure distilled. Other things were worse. Resentment flared, but the script was the only money available, and it still bound the people to the new regime. Supplies were scarce, salt and sugar almost unavailable. Earth had cut off all shipping until the affair was settled, and nobody in the Outlands would deal in script. He came home the third evening to find that Sheila had managed to find space for her bunk in his room, cut off by a heavy screen, and had closed the other room to save the rent. It led to some relaxation between them, and they began talking impersonally. Gordon watched for a sign that Trench had passed on his evidence of the murder of Murdoch, but there was none. The pressure of the beat took his mind from it. Looting had stepped up. Izzy had cooperated reluctantly until Gordon was able to convince him that it was the people who paid his salary. Then he nodded. "It's a hell of a roundabout way of doing things, Governor. But if the geese pay for protection any old way, then they're gonna get it." Hoodlums began moving elsewhere toward easier pickings. Gordon turned his entire pay over to Sheila. At current prices, it would barely keep them in food for a week. "I told you you had a punched meal ticket," he said bitterly. "We'll live," she answered him. "I got a job today. Barmaid on your beat, where being your wife helps." He could think of nothing to say to it, but after supper he went to Izzy's room to arrange for a raid on municipal territory. Such small raids were normally on the excuse of extending the boundaries, but actually they were out-and-out looting. He came back to find her cleaning up and shoved her away. "Go to bed, you look beat. I'll sand these." She started to protest, then let him take over. They never made the looting raid. The next morning they arrived at the precinct house to find them milling around the bulletin board, buzzing over an announcement there. Apparently Chief Justice Arliss had broken with the Wayne administration, and the mimeographed form was a legal ruling that Wayne was no longer mayor. Since the charter had been voided, he was charged with inciting a riot, and a warrant had been issued for his arrest. Hendricks appeared finally. "All right, men," he shouted. "You all see it. We're going to arrest Wayne. By jingo, they can't say we ain't legal now. Every odd-numbered shield goes from every precinct, Gordon. Isaacs, you two been talking big about law and order. Here's a warrant. Take it and arrest Wayne." It took nearly an hour to get the plans settled, but finally they headed for the trucks that had been arriving. Most of them belonged to Nick the Croup, who had apparently decided the legals would win. Gordon and Izzy found the lead truck and led the way. They neared the bar where Sheila was working, and Bruce swore. She was running toward the center of the street, frantically trying to flag him down, and he barely managed to swerve around her. "Ha ha! Damned fool," he muttered. Izzy's pockmarked face soured for a second as he stared at Gordon. "The princess. She sure is." The crew at the barricade had been alerted, and now began clearing it aside hastily, while others kept up a covering fire against the few municipals. The trucks wheeled through, and Gordon dropped back to let scout trucks go ahead and pick off any rash enough to head for the call boxes. They couldn't prevent advance warning, but they could delay and minimize it. They were near the big municipal building when they came to the first real opposition, and it was obviously hastily assembled. The scouts took care of most of the trouble, though a few shots pinged against the truck Gordon was driving. "Rifles," Izzy commented in disgust. "They'll ruin the dome yet. Why can't they stick to knives?" He was studying a map of the big building, picking their best entrance. Ahead, trucks formed a sort of V formation as they reached the grounds around it and began bullying their way through the groups that were trying to organize a defense. Gordon found his way cleared and shot through, emerging behind the defense and driving at full speed toward the entrance Izzy pointed out. "Cut speed. Left sharp," Izzy shouted. "Now and there." They sliced into a small tunnel, scraping their sides where it was barely big enough for the truck. Then they reached a dead end, with just room for them to squeeze through the door of the truck and into an entrance marked with a big notice of privacy. There was a guard beside an elevator, but Izzy's knife took care of him. They ducked around the elevator, unsure of whether it could be remotely controlled, and up a narrow flight of stairs, down a hallway, and up another flight. A municipal corporal at the top grabbed for a warning whistle, but Gordon clipped him with a hasty rabbit punch and shoved him down the stairs. Then they were in front of an ornate door, with their weapons ready. Izzy yanked the door open and dropped flat behind it. Bullets from a submachine gun clipped out, peppering the entrance and the door, and ricocheting down the hall. The yammering stopped, finally, and Izzy stuck his head and one arm out with a snap of his knife. Gordon leaped in, to see a municipal dropping the machine gun. There were about 30 cops inside, gathered around Mayor Wayne, with Trench standing at one side. The fools had obviously expected the machine gun to do all the work. Izzy leaped for the machine gun and yanked it from dead hands, while the cops slowly began raising their arms. Wayne sat petrified, staring unbelievingly, and Gordon drew out the warrant. "Wayne, you're under arrest." Trench moved forward, his hands in the air, but with no mark of surprise or fear on his face. "So the bad pennies turn up. You damned fools. You should have stuck. I had big plans for you, Gordon. I've still got them if you don't insist." His hands whipped down savagely toward his hips and came up sharply. Gordon spun and the gun leaped in his hands, while the submachine gun jerked forward and clicked on an empty chamber. Trench was tumbling forward to avoid the shot, but he twitched as a bullet creased his shoulder. Then he was upright, waving empty hands at them, with the thin smile of his face deepening. He'd had no guns. Gordon jerked around, but Wayne was already disappearing through a heavy door, and the cops were reaching for their guns. Gordon estimated the chances of escape and then leaped forward into their group, with Izzy at his side, seeking close quarters where guns wouldn't work. Gun butts, elbows, fists, and clubs were pounding at him, while his own club lashed out savagely. In 10 seconds things began to haze over, but his arms went on mechanically, seeking the most damage they could work. Then a heavy bellow sounded, and a seeming mountain of flesh thundered across the huge room. There was no shuffle to Mother Corey now. The huge legs pumped steadily, and the great arms were reaching out to flail aside clubs and knives. Men began spewing out of the brawl like straw from a thresher as the old man grabbed arms, legs, or whatever was handy. He had one cop in his left arm, using him as a flail against the others. The municipals broke, and at the first sign Mother Corey leaped forward, dropping his flail and gathering Izzy and Gordon under his arms. He hit the heavy door with his shoulder and crashed through without breaking stride. Stairs lay there, and he took them 3 at a time. He dropped them finally as they came to a side entrance. There was a sporadic firing going on there, and a knot of municipals were clustered around a few legals, busy with knives and clubs. Corey broke into a run again, driving straight into them and through, with Gordon and Izzy on his heels. The surprise element was enough to give them a few seconds. Then they were around a small side building, out of danger. Sheila was holding the door of a large 3-wheeler open. They ducked into it, while she grabbed the wheel. They edged forward until they could make out the shape of the fight going on. The legals had never quite reached the front of the building, obviously, and were now cut into sections. Corey tapped her shoulder, pointing out the route, and she gunned the car. They were through too fast to draw fire from the busy groups of battle-crazed men, leaping across the square and into the first side street they could find. Then she slowed and headed for the main street back to legal territory. "Lucky we found a good car to steal," Mother Corey wheezed. He was puffing now, mopping rivulets of perspiration from his face. "I'm getting old, cobbers. Once I broke every strong man record on earth. Still stand, too. But not now, senile." "You didn't have to come," Izzy said. "When my own granddaughter comes crying for help, she finally admits she needs her old grandfather." Gordon was staring back at the straggling of trucks he could see beginning to break away. The raid was over, and the legals had lost. Trench had tricked him. Izzy grunted suddenly. "Governor, if you're right, and the plain geese pay my salary, who's paying me to start fighting over cops? Or is it maybe that somebody isn't being exactly honest with the scratch they lifted from the geese?" "We still have to eat," Gordon said bitterly. "And to eat, we'll go on doing what we're told." End of Chapter 13. Of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Full Circle. Hendricks had been wounded lightly and was out when Gordon and Izzy reported. But the next day they were switched to a new beat, where trouble had been thickest, and given 12-hour duty, without special overtime. Izzy considered it slowly and shook his head. "That does it, Governor. It ain't honest treating us this way. If the crackle comes from the people, and these geese give everybody a skull-cracking, then they're crooks. It ain't honest, and I'm too sick to work. And if that bloody doctor won't agree—" He turned toward the dispensary. Gordon hesitated, and then swung off woodenly to take up his new beat. Apparently his reputation had gone ahead of him, since most of the hoodlums had decided pickings would be easier on some beat where the cops had their own secret rackets to attend to, instead of head-busting. But once they learned he was alone. But the second day 2 of the citizens fell into a step behind him almost at once, armed with heavy clubs. Periodically during the shift, replacements took their place, making sure that he was never by himself. It surprised him even more when he saw that a couple of the men had come over from his old beat. Something began to burn inside him, but he held himself in, confining his talk to vague comments on the rumors going around. There were enough of them, mostly based on truth. Part of Jurgens' old crowd had broken away from him and established a corner on most of the drugs available. They had secretly traded a supply to Wayne, who had become an addict, for a stock of weapons. Gordon remembered the contraband shipment of guns, and compared it to the increase he'd noticed in weapons, and to the impossible prices the pushers were demanding. It made sense. All kinds of supplies were low, and the outlands beyond Marsport had cut off all shipments. Scrip was useless to them, and the legals were raiding all cargoes destined for Wayne's section, and the municipals had imposed new taxes again. He came back to find what should have been his day off to find Izzy in uniform, waiting grimly. Behind the screen there was a rustling of clothes, and a dress came sailing from behind it. While he stared, Sheila came out, finishing the zipping of her airsuit. She moved to a small bag and began drawing out the gun she had used and a knife. He caught her shoulder and shoved her back, pulling the weapons from her. "Get out of my way, you damned legal machine," she spat. "Easy, Princess," Izzy said. "He hasn't seen it yet, I guess. Here, Governor." He picked up a copy of Randolph's new Little Truth and pointed to the headline, "Security Denounces Rape of Marsport." The story was somewhat cooler than that, but not much. Randolph simply quoted what was supposed to be an official cable from security on Earth, denouncing both governments and demanding that both immediately surrender. It listed the crimes of Wayne, then tore into the legals as a bunch of dupes, sent by North America to foment trouble while they looted the city, and to give the Earth government an excuse for seizing military control of Marsport officially. Citizens were instructed not to cooperate. All members of either government were indicated for high treason to security. He crushed the paper slowly, tearing it to bits with his clenched hands. He'd swallowed the implication that the legals were security. Then it hit him slowly, and he looked up. "Where's Randolph?" "At his plant. At least he left for it, according to Sheila." Gordon picked up Sheila's gun and buckled it on beside his own. She grabbed at it, but he shoved her back again. "You're staying here, Cuddles. You're supposed to be a woman now, remember?" She was swearing hotly as they left, but made no attempt to follow. Gordon broke into a slow trot behind Izzy until they could spot one of the few remaining cabs. He stopped it with his whistle and dumped the passenger out unceremoniously, while Izzy gave the address. "The damned fool opened up on the border. Figured he'd circulate to both sections," Izzy said. "We'd better get out a block up and wait, and I hope we ain't too bloody late." The building was a wreck outside. Inside it was worse. Men in the municipal uniform were working over the small job press and dumping the hands set tight from the boxes on the floor. Men in the municipal uniform were working over the small job press and dumping the hands set tight from the boxes. On the floor, a single legal cop lay under the wreckage, apparently having gotten there first and been taken care of by the later municipals. Randolph had been sitting in a chair between two of the cops, but now he leaped up and tried to flee through the back door. Izzy started forward, but Gordon pulled him back as the cops reached for their weapons. The gun in his hand picked them out at quarters too close for a miss, starting with the cop who had jumped to catch Randolph. Izzy had ducked around the side and now came back, leading the little man. Randolph paid no attention to the dead man, nor to the bruises on his own body. He moved forward to the press, staring at it, and there were tears in his eyes as he ran his hands over the broken metal. Then he looked up at them. "Arrest or rescue?" he asked. "Arrest," a voice from the door said harshly, and Bruce Gordon swung to see 6 illegals filling in, headed by Hendricks himself. The captain nodded at Gordon. "Good work, Sergeant. By jinx, when I heard the municipals were coming, I was scared they'd get him for sure. Crane wants to watch this guy shot in person." He grabbed Randolph by the arm. "You're overlooking something, Hendricks," Gordon cut in. He had moved back toward the wall to face the group. "If you ever look at my record, you'll find I'm an ex-newspaper man myself. This is a rescue. Tie them up, Izzy." Hendricks was faster than Gordon had thought. He had his gun almost up before Gordon could fire. A bluish hole appeared on the man's forehead. He dropped slowly. The others made no trouble as Izzy bound them with baling wire. "And I hope nobody finds them," he commented. "All right, Randy. I guess we're a bunch of refugees heading for the outside, and bloody lucky at that. Proves a man shouldn't have friends." Randolph's face was still greenish-white, but he straightened and managed a feeble smile. "Not to me, Izzy. Right now I can appreciate friends, but you two better get going. I've got some unfinished business to tend to." He moved to one corner and began dragging out an old double-cylinder mimeograph. "Either of you know where I can buy stencils and ink and find some kind of a truck to haul this paper along?" Izzy stopped and stared at the rabbity pale little man. Then he let out a sudden yelp of laughter. "Okay, Randy, we'll find them. Governor, you'd better tell my mother I'll be using the old sheets. Go on, you've got the princess to worry about. We'll be along later." He grabbed Randolph's hand and ducked out the back before Gordon could protest. Izzy could only have meant that they were going to hole up in Mother Corey's old chicken coop. But Gordon had now managed to make a full circle, back to his beginnings on Mars. He'd started at the coop with a deck of cards. Now he was returning with a club. He had counted on at least some regret from Mother Corey, however, but the old man only nodded after hearing that Randolph was safe. "Fanatics, crusaders, and damned fools," he said. He shook his head sadly and went shuffling back to his room, where 2 of his part-time henchmen were sitting. Sheila had been sitting on the bunk, still in her airsuit. Now she jerked upright, then sank back with a slow flush. Her hands were trembling as she reached for a cup of coffee and handed it to him, listening to his quick report of Randolph's safety and the fact that he was going back outside the dome. "I'm all packed," she said, "and I packed your things too." He shot his eyes around the room, realizing that it was practically bare except for a few of her dresses. She'd followed his gaze and shook her head. "I won't need them out there," she said. Her voice caught on that. "They'll be safe here." "So will you now that you've made up with the mother?" he told her. "Your meal ticket's ruined, Cuddles, and you made it clear a little while ago just where you stand. Remind me to tell you sometime how much fun it's been. Your mother was good with a soldering iron, wasn't she? You even look human." She bent to pick up a shoulder pack in a bag, and her face was normal when she stood up again. You might guess that the cops would be happy to get a hold of your wife now, though. Come on. It's a long walk." He left the car beyond the gate, and they pushed through the locker room toward the smaller exit, stopping to fasten down their helmets. The guard halted them, but without any suspicion. "Going hunting for those damned kids, eh?" he said. He stared at Sheila. "Lucky devil. All I got for a guide was an old bum." "Okay, luck, Sergeant." It made no sense to Gordon, but he wasn't going to argue. They went through and out into the waste and slums beyond the domes, heading out until there were only a few phosphor bulbs to guide their way. Gordon was moving cautiously, using his helmet light only occasionally, gun ready in his hand. But it was Sheila who caught the faint sound, and turned to see her crash into the stomach of a man with a half-raised stick. He went down with almost no resistance. Sheila shot the beam of her light on the thin, drawn face. "Rusty?" "Hi, Princess." He got up slowly, trying to grin. "Didn't know who it was. Sorry. Ever get that louse you were out for?" She nodded. "Yeah, I got him. That's him, my husband. What's wrong with you, Rusty? You've lost 50 pounds, and—" "Things are a mite tough out here, Princess. No deliveries. Closed my bar. Been living sort of hand to mouth, but not much mouth." His eyes bulged greedily as she dug into a bag and began to drag out the sandwiches she must have packed for the trip. But he shook his head. "I ain't so bad off. I ate something yesterday. But if you can spare something for the kid—" "Hey, kid." A thin boy of about 16 crept out from behind some rubble, staring uncertainly. Then at the sight of the food, he made a lunge, grabbed it, and hardly waited to get it through the slits of his suit before gulping it down. Rusty sat down, his lined old face breaking into a faint grin. He hesitated, but finally took some of the food. "Shouldn't oughta. You'll need it." He swallowed slowly, as if tasting the food all the way down. "Kid can't talk. Cop caught him peddling one of the Randolph's pamphlets, cut out part of his tongue. But he's all right now. Come on, kid, hurry it up. We gotta convoy these people." They were following a kind of road when headlights bore down on them. Gordon's hand was on his gun as they leaped for shelter, but there was no hostile move from the big truck. He studied it, trying to decide what a truck would be doing here. Then a Marsport amplified voice shouted from it, "Any muckrakers there?" "One," Gordon shouted back and ran toward it, motioning the others to follow. He'd always objected to the nickname, but it made a good code. Randolph's frail hand came down to help them up, but a bigger paw did the actual lifting. "Why didn't you two wait?" Mother Corey asked, his voice booming out of his Marsport. "I figured Izzy'd stop by first. Here, sit over there. Not much room, with my stuff in Randolph's, but it beats walking." "What in the hell brings you back?" Gordon asked. The huge man shrugged ponderously. "A man gets tired of being respectable, Cobber, and I'm getting old and sentimental about the chicken coop." He chuckled, rubbing his hands together. "But not so old that I can't handle a couple of guards that are stubborn about trucks, eh, Izzy?" "Messy but nice," Izzy agreed from the pile above them. "Tell those trained apes of yours to cut the lights, will you, Mother? Somebody must be using the coop." They stopped the truck before reaching the old wreck. In the few dim lights, the old building still gave off an air of mold and decay. Gordon shuddered faintly, then followed Izzy and Mother into the semi-secret entrance. Izzy went ahead almost silent, with a thin strand of wire between his hands, his elbows weaving back and forth, slowly to guide him. He was apparently as familiar with the garret as the knife, but they found no guard. Izzy pressed the seal release and slid in cautiously, while the others followed. In the beam of Gordon's torch, a single figure lay sprawled out on the floor, halfway to the rickety stairs to the main house. Mother Corey grunted and moved quickly to the coughing, battered old air machine. His fingers closed a valve equipped with a combination lock. "They're all dead, cobbers," he wheezed. "Dead because a crook had to try his hand on a lock. Years ago, I had a flask of poison gas attached in case a gang should ever squeeze me out." In the filthy rooms above, Gordon found the corpses, about 15 of them, and some former members of the Jurgens organization. He found the ape-like bodyguard stretched out on a bunk, a vacant smile on his face. A yell from the basement called him back down to where Izzy was busily going through piles of crates and boxes stacked along one wall. He was pointing to a lead foil-covered box. "Dope, and all that other stuff's ammunition." He shivered, staring at the fortune in his hands. Then he grimaced and shoved the open can back in its case. He threw it back and began stacking ammunition cases in front of the dope. Gordon went out to the others and started moving in the supplies and transferring the corpses to the truck for disposal. Randolph scurried off to start setting up his makeshift plant in the basement. Mother Corey was staring about when they returned. "Filthy," he wailed. "A pigeon. They've ruined the coop, cobber. Smell that air?" "Even I can smell it," he sniffed dolefully. Mother Corey sighed again. "Well, it'll give the boy something to do," he decided. "When a man gets old, he likes a little comfort, cobber. Nice things around him." Gordon found what had been his old room and dumped his few things into it. Sheila watched him uncertainly, and then took possession of the next room. She came back a few minutes later, staring at the ages-old filth. "I'll be cleaning for a week," she said. "What are you going to do now, Bruce?" He shook his head and started back down the stairs. He hurried down into the basement where Randolph was arranging his mimeograph. The printer listened only to the first sentence and shook his head impatiently. "I was afraid you'd think of that, Gordon. Look, you never were a reporter. You ran a column. I've read the stuff you wrote. You killed and maimed with words. But you never dug up news that would help people or tell them what they didn't suspect all along. And that's what I've got to have." "Thanks," Gordon said curtly. "Too bad security didn't think I was as lousy a reporter as you do." "Okay, I'll give you a job for 1 week. See what outer Marsport is like. Find what can be done, if anything, and do it if you can, and come back and give me 6 columns on it. I'll pay Mother Corey for your food and for your wife's, and if I can find 1 column's worth of news in it, maybe I'll give you a 2nd week. I can't see a man's wife starve because he doesn't know how to make an honest living." Rusty and one of Mother Corey's men were on guard, and the others had turned in. Gordon went up the stairs and threw himself onto the bed in disgust. "Bruce," Sheila stood outlined in the doorway against the dim glow of a phosphor bulb. Her robe was partly open, and hunger burned in him. Then, before he could lift himself, she bent over and began unfastening his boots. "You all right, Bruce? I heard you tossing around." "I'm fine," he told her mechanically. "Just making plans for tomorrow." He watched her turn back slowly, then lay quietly, trying not to disturb her again. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow he'd finish some kind of an answer, and it wouldn't be Randolph's charity. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Murdoch's Mantle. There were 3 men, each with a white circle painted on chest and left arm, talking to Mother Corey when Bruce Gordon came down the rickety steps. He stopped for a second, but there was no sign of trouble. Then the words of the thin man below reached him. So we figured when we found the stiffs maybe you'd come back, Mother. Damn good thing we were right. We can sure use that ammunition you found. Now where's this Gordon fellow?" "Here," Gordon told the man. He'd recognized him finally as Schulberg, the little grocer from the 19th precinct. The man swung suspiciously, then grinned weakly. There was hunger and strain on his face, but an odd authority and pride now. "I'll be doggoned. Why'n't you say he was with Murdoch?" "They want someone to locate Ed Prager and see about getting some food shipped in from outside, Cobber," Mother Corey told him. "They got some money scraped together, but the Hicks are doing no business with Marsport. You know, Ed. Just tell 'em I sent you. I'd go myself, but I'm getting too old to go chasing men out there." "What's in it?" Gordon asked, reaching for his helmet. There was a surprised exchange of glances from the others, but Mother Corey chuckled. "Heart like a steel trap, Cobber," he said, almost approvingly. "Well, you'll be earning your keep here, yours and that granddaughter's too. Here, you'll need directions for finding Prager." He handed the paper with his scrawling notes on it over to Gordon and went shuffling back. Gordon stuck it into his pouch and followed the three. Outside they had a truck waiting. Rusty and Corey's two henchmen were busy loading it with ammunition from the cellar. Schulberg motioned him into the cab of the truck, and the other two climbed into the closed rear section. "All right," Gordon said. "What goes on?" The other began explaining as he picked a way through the ruin and rubble. Murdoch had done better than Gordon had expected. He'd laid out a program for a citizens' vigilante committee, and had drilled enough in the ruthless use of the club to keep the gangs down. Once the police were all busy inside the dome with their private war, the committee had been the only means of keeping order in the whole territory beyond. It was now extended to cover about half the area, as a voluntary police organization. He pointed outside. It was changed. There were fewer people outside. Gordon had never seen group starvation before. They passed a crowd around a crude gallows, and Schulberg stopped. A man was already dead and dangling. "Should turn him over to us cops," Schulberg said. "What's he hanged for?" "Hoarding," a voice answered, and others supplied the few details. The dead man had been caught with a half bag of flour and part of a case of beans. Schulberg found a scrap of something and penciled the crime on it, together with a circle signature, and pinned it to the body. "All food should be turned in," he explained to Gordon as they climbed back into the truck. "We figure community kitchens can stretch things a bit more, and we give a half extra ration to the guys who can find anything useful to do. We got enough so most people won't starve to death for another week, I guess. But you'd better get Prager to send something, Gordon. Here's the scratch we scraped up." He passed over a bag filled with a collection of small bills and coins. "We can trust you, I guess," he said dully. "Remember you with Murdoch anyhow, and you can tell Prager we got plenty of men looking for work in case he can use 'em." He pulled up to shout a report through a big Mars speaker as they passed an old building Murdoch had used as a precinct house. It now had a crude sign proclaiming it Voluntary Police Headquarters and Outland Government Center. Then he went on until they came to a spur of the little electric monorail system, with 3 abandoned service engines parked at the end. "Extra air inside, and the best we could do for food. Was going to try myself, but I don't know Prager," Schulberg said. He handed over a key and nodded toward the first service engine. "Good luck, Gordon. And damn it, we gotta eat, don't we?" "You tell 'em that. It ain't much, but get what you can." He swung the truck and was gone. Gordon climbed into the enclosed cab and pulled back questioningly on the only lever he could see. The engine backed briefly. He reversed the control. Then it moved forward, picking up speed. Apparently there was still power flowing in from the automatic atomic generators. He got off to puzzle out a switch using Mother Corey's scrawled instructions. He had vaguely expected to see more of Mars, but for 8 hours there was only the bare flatness and dunes of unending sandy surface and scraggly, useless native plants opened out to the sun. Marsport had been located where the only vein of uranium had been found on Mars, and the growing section was closer to the equator. Then he came to villages. Again there was the sight of children running around without helmets. He stopped once for directions, and a man stared at him suspiciously, and finally threw a switch reluctantly. He was finally forced to stop again, sure that he was near now. This time it was in what seemed to be a major shipping center in the heart of the lines that ran helter-skelter from village to village. Another suspicious-eyed man studied him. "You won't find Prager on his farm. Couldn't reach it in that, anyhow," he said finally. Then he turned up his Mars speaker. "Ed. Hey, Ed." Down the street the seal of a building opened, and the big, bluff figure of Prager came out. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Gordon. Then he grinned and waved his visitor forward. Inside there was evidence of food, and a rather pretty girl brought out another platter and set it before Gordon. He ate while they exchanged uncertain, rambling information. Finally he got down to his errand. Prager seemed to read his mind. "I can get the stuff sent, Gordon. I'm head of the shipping committee for this quadrant. But why in the hell should I? The last time every car was looted in outer Marsport. If they won't let us get the oil and chemicals we need, why should we feed them?" "Ever see starvation?" Gordon asked, wishing again someone else who'd felt it could carry the message. He told about a man who'd committed suicide for his kids, not stopping as Prager's face sickened slowly. "Hell, who wouldn't loot your trains if that's going on? All right, if Mother Corey will back up this volunteer police group. I've got kids of my own. Look, you want food? We want to ship. Get your cops to give us an escort for every shipment through the dome, and we'll drop off 1 car out of 4 for the outlands." Gordon sat back weakly. "Done," he said, "provided the first shipment carries the most we can get for the credits I brought." "It will. We've got some stuff that's about to spoil, and we can let you have a whole train of it." He took the stack of credits and tossed it toward a drawer, uncounted. "A damned good thing security's sending a ship. Credits won't be worth much until they get this mess straightened out." Gordon felt the hair at the base of his neck tingle. "What makes you think security can do anything?" "They haven't shown a hand yet." "They will," Prager said. "You guys in Marsport feed yourself so many lies you begin to believe them. But security took Venus, and I'm not worried here in the long run. Don't ask me how." His voice was a mixture of bitterness and an odd certainty. "They set security up as a nice little debating society, Gordon, to make it easy for North America to grab the planets by doing it through that agency. Only they got better men on it than they wanted. So far, security has played one nation against another, enough to keep any from daring to swipe power on the planets. And this latest trick folded up, too. North America figured on Marsport folding up once they got the police war started. With a bunch of chiseling profiteers as their front, they expected the citizens to yell uncle all the way back to Earth. But out here, nobody thinks of Earth as a place to yell to for help. So they missed, and now security's got Pan-Asia and United Africa balanced against North America, so the swipe won't work. We got the dope from our southern receiver. North America's called it all a mistaken emergency measure and turned it back to security." "Along with how many war rockets?" Gordon asked. "None. They never gave any real power. Never will. The only strength security's ever had comes from the fact that it always wins somehow. Forget the crooks and crooked cops, man. Ask the people who've been getting kicked around about security, and you'll find that even most Marsport doesn't hate it. It's the only hope we've got of not having all the planets turn into colonial empires. You staying over, or want me to give you an engineer and drag car so you can ride back in comfort?" Gordon stared at the room where almost everything was a product of the planet. at Prager, and at the girl. Here was a real Mars. The men who liked it here, who were sure of their future. I'll take the drag car. He found Randolph waiting in a scooter outside the precinct house after he'd reported his results. He climbed in woodenly, leaving his helmet on as he saw the broken window. A good job, the little man said, and news for the paper, if I ever publish it again. I came over because I wasn't much use at the coop, and everyone else was busy. Doing what? Gordon asked. Randolph grinned crookedly, running outer Marsport. The mother's the only man everybody knows. I guess, and his word has never been broken that anyone can remember. So he's helping Schulberg make agreements with the sections the volunteers don't handle. Place is lousy with people now. Heard about Mayor Wayne? Gordon shook his head, not caring, but the man went on. He must have had his supply of drugs lifted somehow. He holed up one day until it really hit him that he couldn't get any more. Then he went gunning for Trench, with some idea Trench had swiped the stuff. So Trench is now running the municipals, and I hear the gangs are just about in control of both sections lately. The chicken coop was filled, as Randolph had said, but he slipped in and up the stairs, leaving the news to the publisher. The place had been cleaned up more than he had expected, and there must have been new plants installed besides the blower, since the air was somewhat fresher. He found his own room and turned in automatically. Bruce? A dim light snapped on, and he stared down at Sheila. Then he blinked. His bunk had been changed to a wider one, and she lay under the thin covering on one side. Down the center, crude stitches of heavy cord showed where she had sewed the blanket to the mattress to divide it into two sections, and in one corner a couple of blanket sections formed a rough screen. She caught his stare and reddened slowly. I had to, Bruce. The coop is full, and they needed rooms, and I couldn't tell them that. Forget it, he told her. He dropped to his own side, with barely enough room to slide between the bed and the wall, and began dragging off his boots and uniform. She started up to help him, then jerked back, and turned her head away. Forget all your thinking, Cuddles. I'm still not bothering unwilling women, and I'll even close my eyes when you dress. She sighed and relaxed. There was a faint touch of humor in her voice then. They called it bundling once, I think. Bruce, I know you don't like me, so I guess it isn't too hard for you. But sometimes, oh damn it, sometimes you're nice. Nice people don't get to Mars. They stay on Earth, being careful not to find out what it's like up here, he told her bitterly. For a second he hesitated, and then the account of the newsboy and his would-be killers came rushing out. She dropped a hand onto his, nodding. I knew. The kid, Rusty's friend, wrote down what they did to him. Gordon grunted. He'd almost forgot about the tongueless kid for a second. His thoughts churned on. Then he got up and began putting on his uniform again. Sheila frowned, staring at him, and began sliding from her side, reaching for her robe. She followed him down the creaking stairs and to the room where Schulberg, Mother Corey, and a few others were still arguing some detail. They looked up and he moved forward, dragging a badge from his pouch. He slapped it down on the table in front of them. I'm declaring myself in, he told them coldly. You know enough about security badges to know they can't be forged. That one has my name on it, and rating as a prime. Do you want to shoot me, or will you follow orders? Randolph picked it up and fumbled in his pocket, drawing out a tiny badge and comparing them. He nodded. I lost connection years ago, Gordon, but this makes you my boss. Then give it all the publicity you can and tell them security has just declared war on the whole damn dome section. Mother, I want all the dope we found. With that, about the only supply of any size left. He could command unquestioning loyalty from every addict who hasn't already died from lack of it. Mother Corey nodded, instant understanding running over his putty-like face. Schulberg shrugged. After your deal with Prager, we'd probably follow you anyhow. I don't cotton to security, Gordon, but those devils in there are making our kids starve. Mother Corey heaved his bulk up slowly, wheezing, and indicated his chair at the head of the table. But Gordon shook his head. He'd made his decision. His head was emptied for the moment, and he wanted nothing more than a chance to hit the bed and forget the whole business until morning. Sheila was staring at him as he shucked off his outer clothes mechanically and crawled under the blanket. She let the robe fall to the floor and slid into the bed without taking her eyes off him. "Is it true about security sending a ship?" she asked at last. He nodded, and her breath caught. "What happens when they arrive, Bruce?" She was shivering. He rolled over and patted her shoulder. "Who knows? Who cares? I'll see that they know you weren't guilty, though. Stop worrying about it." She threw herself sideways as far from him as she could get. Her voice was thick, muffled in the blanket. "Damn you, Bruce Gordon. I should have killed you." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Get the Dome. To Gordon's surprise, the publicity Randolph wrote about his being security prime seemed to bring the other sections of Outer Marsport under the volunteer police control even faster. But as he was too busy to worry about it, he left general coordination in the hands of Mother Corey, while Izzy and Schulberg ran the expanding of the police force. Prager arrived with the first load of food, and came storming up to him. "Why didn't you tell me you were a security prime? I'm grade 3 myself." "And I suppose that would have meant you'd have shipped in all the food we need free?" Gordon asked. The other stopped to think it over. Then he laughed roughly. "No, you're right. The growers would starve next year if they gave it all away now. Well, we'll get in enough food this way to keep you going for a while. Couple of weeks at least." It sounded good and might have worked if there had been normal food reserve, or if the other 3 quadrants had been willing to do as much. But while the immediate pressure of starvation was lifted, Gordon's own stomach told him that it wasn't an adequate diet. Signs of scurvy and pellagra were increasing. Bruce Gordon whipped himself into forgetting some of that. His army was growing, or rather his mob. There was no sense in trying to get more than the vaguest organization. It was the 8th day when he led them out in the early dawn. He had issued extra dope and managed a slight increase in the ration, so they made a brave showing, until they reached the dome. There were no rifles opposed to him, as he had expected, and the guard at the gate was no heavier. But the warning had somehow been given, and both forces were ready. Stretching north from the gate were the municipals with members of some of the gangs. The other gangmen were with the legals to the south, and they stood within inches of the dome, holding axes and knives. A big Mars speaker ran out from the gate, and the voice of Gannett came over it. "Go back. If just one of you gets within 10 feet of the dome or entrance, we're going to rip the dome. We'll destroy Marsport before we'll give in to a doped-up crowd of riffraff. You've got 5 minutes to get out of sight before we come out with rifles and knock you off. Now beat it." Gordon got out of the car. The kid was driving and started toward the entrance, just as the moaning wail of the crowd behind him built up. "You fools," he yelled. "They're bluffing. They wouldn't dare destroy the dome. Come on." But already the men were evaporating. He stared at the route, and suddenly stopped fighting the hands holding him. Beside him the kid was crying, making horrible sounds of it. He turned slowly back to the car and felt it get under way. His final sight was that of the legals and municipals, wildly scrambling for cover from each other. Mother Corey met him, dragging him back to a small room, where he dug up an impossibly precious bottle of brandy. "Drink it all, Cobber. So one of your security badges had the wrong man attached to it, and word got back. Couldn't be helped. You just ran into the sacred law of Marsport, the one they teach kids. Be bad, and the dome will collapse. The dome made Marsport, and it's taboo." Gordon nodded. Maybe the old man was right. "If the dome gives him a perfect cover, why let me make a jackass of myself, Mother?" he asked numbly. Corey shook his head, setting the heavy folds of flesh to bouncing. "Gave them something to live for here, Cobber, and when you get over this, you're going to announce new plans to try again. Yes, you are, but right now, you get yourself drunk." He left Gordon the bottle. After a while, the bottle was gone. He felt number, but no better, by the time Izzy came in. "Trench is outside in a heavy armored car, Bruce. Says he wants to see you. Something to discuss. A proposition?" Gordon stood up, wobbling a little, trying to think. Then he swore and headed for his room. Tell him to go to hell. He saw Izzy and Sheila leave, wondering vaguely where she had been. Through the opening of the seal, he spotted them moving toward the big car outside. Then he shrugged. He finally made the stairs and reached his bed before he passed out. Sheila was standing over him when he finally woke. She dumped a headache powder into her palm and held it out, handing him a small glass of water. He swallowed the fast-acting drug and sat up, trying to remember. Then he wished he couldn't. "What did Trench want?" he asked thickly. "He wanted to show you a badge, a security badge made out for him," she answered. "At least he said he wanted to show you something, and it was about that size. He wouldn't talk with us much, but I remember his name in the book." Gordon shook his head and sat up. The book, he thought, trying to focus his thoughts. The book with all the names. "All right, Cuddles," he said finally. "You got your meal ticket, and you've outgrown it in this mess. Now I want that damned book. I've been operating in the dark. It's time I found out how to get in touch with some of those people. Where is it?" She shook her head. "It isn't. Bruce, I don't have it. That time I gave you the note, you didn't come when I said, and I thought you wouldn't. Then Jurgens' men broke in, and I thought they'd get it. So I burned it. I lied to you about using it to make you keep me." "You burned it?" He turned it over, staring at her. "Okay, Cuddles, you burned it. You were trying to kill me then, so you burned it to keep Jurgens from getting it and putting the finger on me. Where is it, Sheila? On you?" She backed away, biting her lips. "No, Bruce, I burned it. I don't know why, I just did." "No!" She turned toward the door as he pushed up from the bed, but his arm caught her wrist, dragging her back. She whimpered once, then shrieked faintly as his hand caught the buttons on the dress, jerking them off. Then suddenly she was a writhing, biting, scratching fury. He tightened his hand and lifted her to the bed, dropping a knee onto her throat and beginning to squeeze, while he jerked the dress and thin slip off. She sat up as he released his knee. Her hoarse voice squeezed from between her writhing lips. "Are you satisfied now, you mechanical beast? Do you still think I have it on me?" He grinned, twisting the corners of his mouth. "You don't, do you? No, a wife shouldn't keep secrets from her husband, a warm-blooded, affectionate husband to boot." He bent down, knocking aside her flailing arms, and pulled her closer to him. "Better tell your husband where the book is, Cuddles." She cursed, and he drew her closer. He bent down, forcing her head back and setting his lips on hers. From somewhere, wetness touched his cheek. He lifted his head and looked down. The wetness came from tears that spilled out of her eyes and ran off onto the mattress. She was making no sound, and there was no resistance, but the tears ran out, one drop seeming to trip over another. "All right, Sheila," he said. His voice was cracked in his ears. "Another week of being a failure on this planet of failures, and I might. Go ahead and tell me I'm the same as your first husband. If I can't even keep my word to you, I can at least get out and stay out." He shook his head, waiting for her denunciation. "For your amusement, I'm going to miss having you around." He stood up. Something touched his hand, and he looked down to see her fingers. "Bruce," she said faintly, "you meant it. You don't hate me any more?" She rubbed her wrist across her eyes, and the ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I don't think you're a failure, and maybe I'm not. Maybe I don't have to be a failure as a woman, a wife, Bruce. I don't want you to go." Two worlds, one huddled under its dome, forever afraid of losing that protection and having to face the life the other led, and yet driven to work together or to perish together. The sacred dome. And suddenly he was shaking her. The dome. It has to be the answer. "Cuddles, you broke the chain enough for me to think again. We've been blind. The whole damned planet has been blind." She blinked and then frowned. "Bruce, I'm all right. I'm just half sane instead of all insane for a change." He got up, pacing the floor as he talked. "Look, most of the people here are Martians. They've left Earth behind, and they're meeting this planet on its own terms, and they're adapting third-generation children. Not all, but a lot of them are breathing the air we'd die on, and they're doing fine at it. Probably second-generation ones can keep going after we'd pass out. It's just as true out here as it is on the frontier. But Marsport has that sacred dome over it. It's still trying to be Earth, and it can't do it. It's never had a chance to adjust here, and it's afraid to try." "Maybe," she agreed doubtfully. "But what about this part of Marsport?" "Obvious. Here they grow up under the shadow of it. They live in a half-world, and they have to live on the crumbs the dome tosses them. Sheila, if something happened to that dome—" "We'd be killed," she said. "How do we do it?" He frowned and then grinned slowly. "Maybe not." They spent the rest of the night discussing it. Sometime during the discussion she made coffee, and first Randolph, then the kid came in for briefing. Randolph was a natural addition, and the kid had been alternately following Gordon and Sheila around since he'd first heard they were fighting against the men who'd robbed him of his right to speak. In the end, as the night spread into day, there were more people than they felt safe with, and less than they needed. But later, as he stood beside the dome when night had fallen again, Gordon wasn't so sure. It was huge. The fabric of it was thin, and even the webbing straps that gave it added strength were frail things. But it was strong enough to hold up in the pressure of over 10 pounds per square inch, and the webbing was anchored in a metal sleeve that went too high for cutting. They could rip it, but not ruin it completely, and it had to be done so that no repair could ever be made. Under it, and anchoring it, was a concrete wall all around the city. Izzy came back from a careful exploration. "We can work enough powder under those webbing supports, and lay the fuse wire beside the plastic ring that keeps it airtight," he reported. "But God help us, Governor, if any geese spot us." They worked through the night, while Rusty went back to requisition more explosives from the dwindling supply, and while the kid and Izzy took time off to break into a closed converter plant and find wire enough to connect the charges. but dawn caught them with less done than they had hoped. Gordon went to connect a wire and switch from the battery and coil they had installed, but jerked backwards as he saw a suspicious guard staring at him. "Let him think we're just scouting," Randolph advised. There were suspicious looks as the group came back to the coop, but Mother Corey waddled over to meet them. "Did you find them, Cobber?" he asked quickly, and one of his eyelids flickered. Izzy answered before Gordon could rise to it. "Not yet, Mother. May have to go back tonight." Gordon left them discussing the mythical search for certain supplies that Mother Corey had apparently used as an alibi for their absence from the building. Sheila started to make coffee, but he shook his head and headed for the bed. She yawned and nodded, fingering the stitches that still ran down the blanket to divide it. Then she grimaced faintly and dropped down beside him on top of the blanket. Her head hit his arm, and she seemed to be asleep almost at once. He awoke to find Izzy shaking his shoulder. He looked down for Sheila, but she was gone. Izzy followed his eyes and shook his head. "The princess took off in a car 3 hours ago," he said. "She said it was something that had to be done, Governor, so I figured you'd know about it." Gordon shrugged and let it pass. He found the rest of the group ready, with Mother Corey wishing them better luck tonight. The mother obviously knew something, but he kept his suspicions to himself and gave them a cover from the others. There was no sign of Sheila near the dome, but inside there were guards pacing along it. Gordon spotted them first and drew the others back. If they'd found the carefully worked-in powder. The kid ducked down and out of the car, worming his way around the building that concealed them. He waited for the guard to vanish, then went crawling forward. Gordon swore, but there was no sense in two of them risking themselves, only to attract more attention. And at last the kid came back. He ducked into the truck, nodding. "Wire and explosive still there?" Gordon asked. The kid made the sound he used for assent. It made no sense. There was no reason for the sudden vigilance inside the dome. "We might be able to run the wire in," Izzy said doubtfully. Gordon grunted. "And tip them off to where it is? Probably. No, we'll have to do it under some kind of covering. The way I had it planned in the first place, only with one more damned complication. We'll pull another false raid on the dome. As soon as we get chased off, I'll manage to set it off while they're relaxing and laughing at us." "It smells," Izzy told him. "Who elected you chief martyr around here? You'll be blown up, Governor. And if you ain't, they'll rip you to ribbons for knocking off the dome." Then he stopped suddenly, staring. Bruce Gordon leaned forward with Izzy's hands grabbing for him, but he'd seen it too. Standing next to the dome was Trench, talking to one of the guards, and beside him stood Sheila, with one hand resting on the man's elbow. He could feel the thickness of the silence and misery in the truck, but he pushed it away, with all the other things. "Get us back, Izzy," he ordered. "We've got to round up whatever group we can and get them back here on the double. They must be counting on our original time, so they're in no hurry to remove the powder and wiring. But we can't count on any more time." "You're going through with it?" Randolph asked doubtfully. "In 1 hour, and you might pass the word along that we're doing it to save the dome. Tell the men we just found out that Trench is losing and intends to blow it up instead of letting the legals win." Rumor would travel fast enough, he hoped, and it should give him a few extra seconds before his forces cracked. He lifted the switch in his hands and stared at it. It wasn't necessary now. All he had to do was reach the battery and drop any metal across the 2 terminals there. If they could get back before Trench and Sheila could remove the battery. It was a period of complete fog to him, but it wasn't until his motley army reached the dome, straggling up in trucks and on foot, that he snapped into focus again. There was no sign of Sheila this time, and he didn't look for her. His whole mind was concentrated down to a single point. Get the dome. This time there was no scattering of municipals and legals. The municipal forces were rushing up toward the dome, and surprised legals were frantically arriving in trucks. There was the beginning of a pitched battle right at the spot where Gordon needed his own cover. It made no sense to him, and he didn't care. He marched his men up, with a thin wailing of a banshee in his ears. "Dome warning," Izzy shouted in his ear. "Hear that siren, Governor? Means they're scared we may do it. Give me that damned switch." He grabbed for it, but Gordon held firmly to the copper strap. And now the men inside caught sight of the approaching force. For a second consternation seemed to reign. Then a huge truck with a speaker on top drove into the struggling group, and the thin whisper of unintelligible words reached Gordon. The whole development made no more sense than any part of it to him. But he saw the municipals and legals suddenly begin to turn as a single man to face the outside menace that had crept up on them while they were boiling into a fight. And suddenly the Mars speaker over the entrance blasted into life. "Get back! The dome is mined. Any man comes near it, it'll blow." By Gordon's side a sudden gargling sound came from the kid. His hand snaked out, caught the strap from Gordon's hand, and jerked it free. Then he was running frantically forward. Rifles lifted inside and shots rang out, clipping bullets through the dome. In one place it began to tear, and there was a sudden savage roar from the men around Gordon. He had started forward after the kid, but Izzy was in front of him, holding him back. The kid stumbled and slid across the ground, while blood spurted out from a gash across his head, and the helmet fell into pieces. Then with a jerk he was up. His hand reached out. The strap hit the terminals. And where the dome had been, a clap of thunder seemed to take visible form. The webbing straps broke, and the dome jerked upwards, twisting outwards, and then falling into ribbons. The shock wave hit Gordon, knocking him from his feet into the crowd around him. He struggled to his feet to see helmeted men pouring out of the houses around, and other men pouring forward from his own group. The few of either police force still standing and helmeted broke into a wild run, but they had no chance. The mob had decided that they had mined and exploded the dome. He turned back toward the coupe, sick with the death of the kid and the violence. For once he'd had more than his fill of it. Then a small truck drew up, and an arm went out to draw him inside the cab. He stared into the face of Isaiah Trench, and driving the truck was Sheila. "Your wife took a hell of a chance, Gordon," Trench said heavily, "and I took quite a chance, too, to set this up so nobody could ever believe you were behind it. Getting that fight started in time after you first showed up, oh sure, we spotted you, was the toughest job I ever did. But I guess Sheila had the roughest end, not even knowing for sure where I stood." Gordon stared at them slowly, not quite believing it, even though it was no crazier than anything else during the past few hours. Trench shrugged. "I was railroaded here by security, told to be good and they'd let me go home. A lot of men got that treatment. So when Wayne was still talking about building a perfect Marsport, I joined up. He treated me right, and I took orders. But a man gets sick of working with punks and cheap hoods. He gets sicker of killing off a planet he's learned to like. I learned to take orders, though, and I took them until Wayne tried to put a bullet through me. That ended that, and I came out to join up with you. You were sauced, I hear, but your wife guessed enough to take the chance of coming to me when she thought you were going to get yourself killed. Well, I guess you get out here." He indicated the coupe. Gordon got down, followed by Sheila as Trench took the wheel. "What happens to you now?" Gordon asked. "They'll be blaming you for the end of the dome." "Let them. I planned on that. Too bad Trench got torn to bits by the mob, isn't it? And it's a good thing I've always kept myself a place under a safe incognito out in the sticks. Got a wife and 2 kids out there that even Wayne didn't know about. He stuck out a hand. You're like security, Gordon. You do all the wrong things, but you get the right results. Goodbye. Sheila watched him go, shaking her head. He likes you, Bruce, but he can't say it. Men. Women, Gordon answered. Then he stiffened. Coming down through the thin air of Mars was the bright blue exhaust of a rocket. The real security was arriving. End of chapter 16. Of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Security Payoff. It was 3 days before Bruce Gordon made up his mind to hunt up security. Another 4 days passed after they had sent him back to wait until they received orders from headquarters for him. There was a man coming from Earth on a second ship who would see him. They gave him a chauffeur back to the chicken coop and politely indicated that it would be better if he stayed within reach. The dome had been down a full week when he watched the last of Randolph's equipment packed onto a truck and hauled away. The little publisher was back at the Crusader again. Rusty was busy opening his bar, and the others were all busy. Only Gordon and Sheila were left. He heard her coming down the old stairs and ducked out through the private exit, snapping his helmet in place as he went through the seal. She must have sensed his desire to be left alone, since she made no attempt to follow. She'd asked no questions and hadn't even tried to convince him that he'd be sent back to Earth now. He muttered to himself as he headed over the rubble toward the previously domed section. Out at the spaceport, ships were dropping down from Deimos with the supplies that had been held up so long, and a long line of trucks went snaking by. Credit had been established again, and the businesses were open. For the time being, the Hoods and Punks were having a tough time of it, with working papers demanded as constant identification. And while it lasted, at least, Marsport was beginning to have its face lifted. Wrecks were being broken up, with salvageable material used for newer homes. Gordon came to a row of temporary bubbles, individual dwellings built like the dome, but opaque for privacy. As Gordon drew closer to the old foundation of the dome, the feeling around began to clarify into something halfway between what he had seen on that real frontier and what he had known as a kid in Earth's slums. They had been lucky. The dome had exploded outwards, with only bits of it falling back, and the buildings had come through the outward explosion of the pressure with little damage. Gordon grinned wryly. Schulberg's volunteers were official now. Izzy was acting as chief of police. Schulberg was head of the Reconstruction Corps, and Mother Corey was temporary mayor of all Marsport. The old charter for Marsport from North America was dead, and the whole city was now under security charter, like the rest of the planet. But the dozen security men had left most of the control in Mother's hands, and the old man was up to his fat jowls in business. Gordon moved automatically toward the 7th Ward. Fat's place was still open, though the crooked tables had been removed. Gordon dropped to a stool, slipping off his helmet. He reached automatically for the glass of ether-needled beer. This time it even tasted good to him. "On the house, copper," Fat's voice said. The man dropped to another stool, rolling dice casually between his thumbs. "And bringing out a steak there. You look as if you could stand it. And Fats don't forget old friends." "Friends and other things," Gordon said, remembering his first visit there. "Maybe you should have got me that night, Fats." The other shrugged. That's Mars. He rolled the dice out, then picked them up again. Guess I'll have to stick to selling meals mostly, for a while at least. Somebody told me you joined security and got banged up trying to keep Trench from blowing up the dome. Thought you'd be in the chips. That's Mars, Gordon echoed the other's comment. Why don't you pull off the planet, Fats? You could go back to Earth, I'd guess. The other nodded. Yeah, I went back about 10 years ago. Spent 4 weeks down there. I don't know. Guess a man gets used to anything. Hell, maybe I can hire some bums to sit around and whoop it up when the ships come in, and bill this as a real old Martian den of sin. Get a barker out at the port, run special buses, charge the suckers a mint for a cheap thrill. Gordon grinned wryly. Fats would probably make more than ever. He finished the meal, accepted a pack of the Earth cigarettes that sold at a luxury price here, and went out into the thin air of Mars. It was almost good to get out into the filth of the slums and be heading back to the still-standing monument of the old chicken coop. He headed for the private entrance out of habit, and then shrugged as he realized it was a needless precaution now. He moved up the front steps and through the battered seal. Then he stopped. Security had finally gotten around to him, it seemed. Inside the hallway, the security man who'd first sent him to Mars was waiting. There was a grin on the other's face. Hello, Gordon. Finally got our orders for you. It's Mercury. Bruce Gordon nodded slowly. All right, I suppose you know I ruined the dome. Was supposed to have killed Murdoch. Pretended I was a security agent. You were one, the man said. He grinned again. We know about Murdoch, and we know where Trench is. But he's a good citizen now, so he can stay there. We're not throwing the book at you, Bruce. Damn it, we sent you here to get results, and you got them. We sent 20 others the same way, and they failed. You were a bit drastic, that I have to admit, but we're one step closer to keeping nationalism off the planet. And that's all we care about. I wonder if it's worth it, Gordon said slowly. The other shook his head. We can't know in our lifetime. All we can do is to hope. We'll probably get this Mother Corey and Isaacs elected properly, and for a while things will improve. But there'll be pushers as long as weak men turn to drugs, and graft as long as voters allow the thing to get out of their hands. Let's say you've shifted some of the misery around a bit and given them a chance to do better. It's up to them to take it or lose it. So I get sent to Mercury? You can't stay here. They'll find out too much eventually. He paused, estimating Gordon. You can go back to Earth, Bruce, but you won't like it now. You're a fighter, and there's hell brewing on Mercury. Worse than here. We've got permission to send you there, if you'll go. With a yellow ticket again, but without any razzle-dazzle this time. The only thing you'll get out of it is a chance to fight for a better chance for others someday. And a promise that there'll be more until you get old enough to sit at a desk on Earth and fight against every bickering nation there is to keep the planets clean. There's a rocket waiting to transship you to the moon on the way to Mercury right now. Gordon sighed. All right, but I wish you'd tell my wife sometime that I didn't just run out on her. She's had bad luck with men. She already knows, the security man said. I've been waiting for you for quite a while, you know. And I paid her the pay we owe you from the time you began using your badge. She's out shopping. The car pulled up to the waiting rocket, and the security man helped him up the steps with a perfunctory wish for good luck. Then Bruce Gordon stopped as great arms surrounded him. Mother Corey was immaculate, though not much prettier. But his old eyes were glinting. Did you think we'd let you go without seeing you off, Cobber? He asked. And after I took a bath to celebrate? Oh, drat it, I'm getting old, Izzy, you tell him. He grabbed Gordon's hand and waddled down the landing plank. Izzy shook his head. "I can't say it either, Governor, but some day I'm going to have one of those badges myself. Like I always said, honesty sure pays, even if it kills you. Here." He followed Mother Corey, leaving behind his favorite knife and a brand-new deck of reader cards, marked exactly as the ones Gordon first used. Gordon dropped into his seat, while the sounds outside indicated takeoff time. He had less than 100 credits, a knife, a deck of phony cards, and a yellow ticket. Mars was leaving him what he'd brought. She dropped into the seat very quietly, but her blouse touched his arm. In her hand was a punched ticket with the orange of Mars on top, and the black of Mercury on the bottom. "Hello, Bruce," Sheila said softly. "I've been shopping, and I spent the money the man gave me. This is all I have left. Do you think it's worth it? Or should I take it back?" He turned it over in his hands slowly, and the smile came back to his face gradually. "You got a bargain, Cuddles," he said. "A lot better than the meal ticket you bought. Let's keep it." End of Chapter 17. End of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. Recording by Christian Alexander.